All right. Last week we ended here at the end of Ecclesiastes chapter 7, discussing this final aspect of wisdom that Solomon has observed. And we talked about the literal aspect of it that we find. I mentioned how that Garrett, one of our commentators that we've kind of looked at, who's an expert in Old Testament poetry, he believes that this is a literal reference. May have something to do with Solomon's experiences with his many wives. We know from Nehemiah, it points out there, and I think it's chapter 3, that Solomon specifically, how he was led astray by all these wives and the condemnation of marrying these people outside of Israel, that this is what caused Solomon and all of his wisdom to fall away. And that is possible. That is possible that that's what Solomon's referencing here in verses 26 through 29. But notice how that Solomon, he says, I find more bitter than death the woman whose heart is snares and nets, whose hands are fetters. Notice he doesn't say all women are, their heart is snares and their nets and their hands are fetters. He references the type of person, and in particular the type of person who would attract those who are foolish as opposed to those who seek to please God. He who pleases God shall escape from her. Why? Because he's not going to be attracted to that type of companion. He's going to be attracted to the type of woman who seeks to please God rather than the type of woman who seeks to be manipulative, to usurp the authority that God has established. This is what Solomon is warning when he says the sinner shall be trapped by her. The individual who only seeks according to under the sun, lusts of the flesh and so forth, if that's all that they care about, then they're likely going to end up with someone like this as opposed to a faithful person seeking out another faithful person. In verse 27, here is what I have found, says the preacher, adding one thing to the other to find out the reason. So keep in mind that as Solomon is utilizing the wisdom that was miraculously given to him by God, he's coupling this also with the knowledge and wisdom that he himself has gained not only as a king, but also in himself determining to figure out the nature of mankind, of men and women, and the concept of wisdom as it's associated, we saw earlier, but the concept that don't ever think yourself perfect. Because we know, as Paul says, all have sinned. All right, well, Solomon understands that there is not a single person who pleases God who can claim to be perfect. That person doesn't exist. So in verse 28, when he says that my soul still seeks, but I cannot find. So this is the link between verse 27 and 28. It's associating, I'm adding one thing to the other to find out the reason, which my soul still seeks, but I can't find why. I can't find the reason. And I'm going to suggest to you that verse 28, I went through the Hebrew here in verse 28, and I'm going to offer this to you. One man among 1,000 I have found, and a woman among all these I have not found. A lot of times the term "but" here suggests that there's a contrast being made, as if all of the attention is being placed on the woman. But I'm going to suggest to you, because that term, in fact, there is no conjunctive but or and there in verse 28. In the Hebrew, it's just one man among 1,000 I found, a woman among all these I have not. Okay, there is no term and or but there. It's what I'm going to suggest to you is that this isn't so much a contrast showing the sinfulness of women. I'm suggesting that I don't think that's what Solomon's pointing out. I think this fits back into the broader context of none are righteous. And in fact, the whole point of verse 26 of bringing this out is how easily man can be influenced, especially when he is considering a companion who does not seek to please God. Well, what's the reason why there are so few righteous people? Because so often righteous people don't seek other righteous people out to be companions in life, to marry. And so when Solomon says, one man among 1,000 I have found, he's describing how rare it is. Not that man is better than women, but the prospect, notice the rarity. One man among 1,000. That's let's see, what's the math on that? I know from 100, that's 1%. So what would the math be on that? 0.5%? Somebody good at math, tell me? 0.1%? 0.1%? Thank you. That's how rare it is to find someone who is wise, who seeks to please God, and at least in terms of the standard that God has established, who is meeting that standard. Not to say that he's found one perfect person, but from the standard of seeking to please God, that's what he's found. He's not suggesting that one man among 1,000 self-professed Christians, in our case, or people of God, that only one man truly was perfect. That's not what Solomon is saying. He's using this in a broad way. In fact, the term man here, we talked about this a little bit before, but instead of talking about there's an individual term for man in the Hebrew, but then there's a generic term for man in the Hebrew. And the generic term is what he uses here to describe mankind, all of man. One man in 1,000 I found that are faithful to God. They follow the standards. And a woman among all these I have not found. In that same sample size of 1,000 people, a faithful woman I haven't. Why is that? Why have you not found? Truly this only I have found, that God made man upright. This is what God intended for mankind, to be upright. His entire job is to fear God and obey his commandments. That's what man's job is. God made man upright, but they have sought out many schemes. To me, the broader context of verses 26 through 29 fits in within that umbrella of there is none righteous who are perfect. There are plenty of people who seek to please God, but none who are perfect. And in describing that, he goes off verse 26 and through verse 29 to describe the dangers of the influences of people upon the righteous, upon those who are seeking to be faithful. And it is to that I think Solomon, speaking everything that he says, how easily man can be influenced to the point that one man among 1,000 I found, and a woman among all these I haven't found. Because it's so difficult for faithful people, especially if their minds are under the sun, and they're thinking in terms of physical nature, they're thinking in terms of the way the world thinks, especially when looking for companions, for wives and husbands, that ultimately they end up falling away. And even still in this vein of thinking, Solomon's experience certainly would be playing a part in what he concludes here. That out of all of his wives and concubines, that the majority of those women were all foreign women who had foreign gods, that they did not serve Jehovah. And of course, they influenced Solomon, whether he thought that was going to happen or he thought he was too wise or too strong to let that happen. When he married them, it did happen. And now as he looks back on this, he observes how difficult it is for faithful people to stay faithful given the influences that we face. Thoughts or comments through verse 29. And as I said, I know Garrett takes a very literal approach to this, that he's describing that men tend to be more faithful than women because, as he points out here in verse 28, Garrett says, does not mean that men are slightly better than women. It describes the reality that although most men can find at least one man who is a true friend, they never find a woman with whom they can enjoy such companionship without competition. That's his conclusion of verse 28. But what he's suggesting then is that whom I have found, that what Solomon's saying is, whom I found that can be a kindred spirit. That's what Garrett's assuming here. That's what Solomon's saying. I tend to think that Solomon's saying that I have found that fits into this characteristic of he who pleases God. I believe that's what Solomon is describing in verse 28. Those who seek to please God, and those who are actually doing so. Not that they're perfect, but they're obeying God, and then when they commit sin, they offer the sacrifices and so forth. Those who are seeking to please God, this is how rare they are. And this is how easily influenced they can be if they're not careful. So, whichever way you want to take that, literally or looking at it the way I'm looking at it isn't so much figuratively, it's just more, I guess it's a broader principle that he's establishing that I'm kind of considering here. Thoughts or comments? Nolan?
For me, I would back up even a few more verses and take it in a larger context if possible. He's talked about his own wisdom, and he had this, to me the key to all this is the searching and what he finds or doesn't find.
Right.
So he knows he's given a gift of wisdom, but I want to find the full depth of what all wisdom is, but also, I want to find out about folly and wickedness and understand the depth of that. So he's going through this search, and by the end, I haven't figured it out. I don't know. It's far beyond. Solomon speaking to his own limitations,
right,
even as the wisest person who ever lived. And so, to me, I don't see these numbers as literal, 1,000, just representative.
Right.
Like we might say, well, I did some research, and out of 1,000 or 1,000,000 cases, where he's done all this. I counted. I took time and went person by person, thing by thing. Someone says, I couldn't figure it out. His conclusion in the last verse, God made us upright.
Yeah.
Man comes up with all kinds of things that someone says, I don't even grasp or can't put a literal number on or figure out.
Right.
So,
and
so even his search, in light of the whole book, his search was vain. It's all the things he's done in the book.
Yeah. Yeah. And to a certain extent, when he describes the fact that this is what I have found. This only I have found, he says in verse 29. And in a lot of ways, Solomon's purpose in searching wasn't just to search out the idea of wisdom versus folly, but why man chooses to do the things that he does. Man's motivations, man's nature in doing it. That's part of what verse 26 kind of alludes to. The fact that there are these type of women who can draw men to themselves. These are foolish. He says, the sinner shall be trapped by her. Well, in what way? Well, Solomon, this constant contrast between the righteous being wise and the sinner being foolish, or the wicked being foolish. And so that constant give and take of wisdom and foolishness continues all the way through verse 29, in that here's the foolishness or the folly of man, of mankind. Not that all men are like that or all women are like that, but that this is what man has done. They have sought out many schemes, despite the fact that God intended for them to be upright. And he gave man the tools to be upright. Yet man, because of his desires and his many inventions, his schemes, that even Solomon, in all of his wisdom, all of the motivations and the reasons behind it, there's not one attributing characteristic that Solomon can nail down. This is the way man is. Man tends to be foolish instead of being wise. Yes, sir.
I think you alluded to it there, but within this section, he says there's as much opportunity, depth, breadth, height for wisdom as there is for foolishness or wickedness.
Mm-hmm.
But as you said, it's the motivation of man and what you're going to search out. You'll find that if that's the path you choose.
Right. Right. And, in a lot of ways, he's also describing what man commits himself to in that choosing. By choosing folly, by choosing wickedness, here's this path that you go down. Here's the consequences in some ways of that path versus those who seek to be pleasing to God. There's a path that goes along with that, and if you commit yourself to that, then you can escape certain folly and wickedness and so forth. Anything else through verse 29? Yes, sir.
What you just said, and Nolan said, this path, there's two paths, and they're not compatible.
No, they're not.
That's the problem. They're
Yeah.
not compatible. People think they can do both. They can have their schemes and follow God. Well, it's like the fountain has bitter and sweet water. No, it can't have both. It's
Right.
one or the other.
Right.
And people think, well, I can do both.
Right.
I think people in this world, on Sundays, they're the best people that are, but the rest of the week they do what they want, their scheme, whatever their motive is to be fun, be
Right.
happy, be their life goals, and they think they won't have it all.
Yeah.
Instead of, if you put God first, God will let you give you all.
Right.
But instead of you taking what you think.
Right. Yeah. And it's interesting in verse 26, he who pleases God, Solomon doesn't say has the opportunity or could escape from her. He who pleases God, this is the person whose mind is set on doing what God wants, mind who's set on fearing God and keep his commandments. He will escape from her because he will not be yielding to that influence. He will not be paying attention to that type of character, especially in connection with being attracted to that type of person. But the sinner shall be. This is what the wicked, this is what they seek. This is what they're pursuing. The man, he who pleases God, seeks to please God, what is he pursuing? He's pursuing heaven. So he understands that under the sun there are some attributes that are only skin deep that we don't need to get so caught up in, as opposed to the wicked who that's all they see, it's just skin deep. Anything else? Sorry.
I was just going to say, he basically described his life in verse 29.
Yeah.
I mean, God made him upright, gave him this intelligence, this wisdom to make every good decision possible, which he did a lot of.
Yeah.
But he sought out many schemes, a lot of them female.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know.
Yeah. And in a lot of ways, I really do believe that in some form or fashion, the very things that he's been describing, especially earlier in chapter 7, the overconfidence, the sense in which I can't falter. I have all this knowledge, I have all this wisdom, I can withstand anything. And I tend to think that Solomon, speaking from experience, that perhaps he himself had that same thought process. Perhaps when he was marrying all these foreign women, perhaps he got caught up in their appearances as opposed to their character. And as a result, because of his decisions, without even thinking about it, without that wisdom throwing up a red flag, he himself kind of brought himself into that snare and trap. And so of all people to talk about the danger of evil influences, at least in that specific application, Solomon's a great one to talk about it.
We all know how much our spouses influence us, both ways.
Good or bad, yeah.
And him with, 1 or 200 battles,
Yeah.
tell him,
Yeah,
So, of course, everybody in this room are accepting.
yeah. But it's interesting because wasn't it 300 wives and 700 concubines? Was that the number? So, that, interestingly enough, that adds up to about 1,000. Not that that's an exact number, but that was kind of the rounded up number. 300 wives, 700 concubines, and Solomon says out of all of these, especially given what his mind was while he was not serving God by choosing the wives among his people who serve Jehovah, in doing all of that, among all of these, I haven't found a single one who was willing to serve God. Now again, whether or not he's talking about his wives specifically or not, certainly that's part of what he's describing is that how dangerous that influence can be. Yeah. Anything else to verse 29? All right, chapter 8. So in chapter 8, he's going to move off from just the danger or the recognition that death is the end of all men, that we need to be careful in how we live, that we have the right priorities, not thinking ourselves immune to evil influences, immune to being at fault in matters. he's going to move on to the value of wisdom, especially as it relates to those who are in authority. So here in verse 1, who is like a wise man and who knows the interpretation of a thing? A man's wisdom makes his face shine, and the sternness of his face is changed. He's not asking, hey, you tell me who's like a wise man. Who can know the interpretation of a thing? It's a rhetorical question. Is there anyone else that has the value and the attitude and the mindset of someone who is wise? That's what Solomon's asking. It's a rhetorical question. Is there anyone else other than a wise man who can know the interpretation of a thing? He's not talking about interpretation of visions or dreams or anything like that, but to understand events and the cause and effect of these events, putting two and two together, just as he described back in chapter 7, of laying one thing next to another to understand the reason of things. It takes someone wise and objective to a degree to be able to line things up and say, you know what, how did this affect this and why did that happen? And this is what Solomon's describing here. Interestingly, given the fact that starting in verse 2, he's going to start talking about the king, Garrett, he says an alternative translation is possible based on the Hebrew here. Who is like a wise man who knows the explanation of a situation? A man's wisdom causes the king to show him favor so that the power of the king's face is redirected. Even though the term king isn't used here in verse 1 in the Hebrew, this is what Garrett says, that this is an alternative translation in that he's describing a man's wisdom makes his face shine. In what way? Well, given the broader context, it's someone who, because of that wisdom, they are of value to others, and in particular to kings and people who are in authority. A man's wisdom makes his face shine. Well, not literally, but in the sense that this man is somebody that they want to have around. People who are in authority, people who have power, they want to have people who are wise, generally speaking, around them to help them in these matters. I mean, this is why kings had advisors and counselors to be able to kind of help them think through things. Even kings who were really, really proud and really thought themselves to be the be-all and end-all, even they tended to have at least some subset of individuals that they talked to, that they referred to, and maybe sought counsel from. And it says the sternness, this term in the Hebrew, it means strength. And I tend to think when he says the sternness or the strength of his face is changed, it's the sense in which how that person, not so much his literal face, but how that person as a person is different from everyone else. He stands out. A man's wisdom makes his face shine. There is a sense in which that stands out as well. But notice that Solomon describes a man's wisdom here in this first part, then the sternness of his face is changed. Because of his wisdom, his behavior and his conduct makes him stand out. I tend to think that that's whether he's going to kind of the specific application of this is alluding to the king, or even generically, to which Solomon then narrows it down to the king, verse 2. Either way, this is going to be true. This is kind of one of those truism type things. A man's wisdom, it changes how he feels and how he thinks, how he behaves with others. And so when he is perceived by others, they see a sense of strength. They see, and generally people, when they think about people who are wise, it's a silent strength. I remember, was it Rio Bravo? There's a quote that John Wayne made about one of the young guys. I'm trying to remember. Was it Rio Bravo? It wasn't Willie Nelson, but it was the other Nelson. Ricky Nelson. Yeah, he was in one of those. Thank you. He was. Somebody knows their John Wayne shows. One of those movies. He's playing guitar and that sort of thing. But he was a really good shot. Okay, and somebody was asking John Wayne, "You think he's that good?" And John Wayne says, "I think he's really good. I think he's so good he doesn't have to prove it." And that quote has always stuck with me. That he's so good he doesn't have to prove it. And to me, of course, when I first saw that movie, I was young. But the fact that this young guy, who couldn't have been more than 20 years old at the time, Ricky Nelson playing the character that he was playing, He was that wise that he didn't have to show how good he was with his gun, that he didn't need to prove anything to anybody because he knew who he was. He knew what he could do. And I kind of think about this concept as well, that when it comes to wise people, they don't have to prove it. They know, based on the fact that they follow God and they take the wisdom that God gives them, they know what they know. They know who they are, and they know what they can do with that wisdom. And it's a silent wisdom, or quiet wisdom, rather. It is a quiet strength. It is not one that is imposing on others. It's not one that is constantly seeking validation. And to me, that's what Solomon is describing here in verse 1. Thoughts or comments so far?
You can see it on their face. It's not like Barney Fife that,
Yeah.
that, he's not sure of anything.
Yeah.
Type thing where you can tell the confidence in someone
Yeah.
in their face.
Yep.
And, or even when they, he says the interpretation of a thing.
Yeah.
To problem solve, and then, it shows on your face when you solve the problem.
Right. And it often shows when you're thinking about a problem.
Versus the other way around when you have it and the dilemma, and
Yeah.
you see it in their face.
And you don't know what to do, and you're panicking. Yep. Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point. Everything of life gets filtered differently in the mind of someone who is wise and objective versus someone who is unwise and is quick to make a decision, or who is facing a dilemma, starts panicking. They don't know what to do. They don't know what choice to make. People who are wise and who trust in not necessarily their wisdom, but in the wisdom of God, and therefore the wisdom God has given them, they trust in that. And as a result, there's a certain aspect of peace associated with it as well. I saw your hand on? Nope, okay. Anything else through verse 1?
When Stephen was talking in the council, like he conceived,
Mm.
they said his face shone like an angel. I think it has more to do with the fact that they can see wisdom coming from.
Yeah, I remember when we talked in Acts chapter 7 about Stephen and his addressing, maybe it was the end of Acts chapter 6, beginning of chapter 7, I forget where that is. Yeah, okay. And that we talked about, some commentaries to describe that as something miraculous. But if it had been something miraculous, you'd think that the Sanhedrin would have paid extra attention and would have been wowed by it and everything else. And I think you're right. I think that Stephen's face was shining in the sense of the wisdom and the confidence with which he spoke, the things that he was saying regarding the law and the history of Israel and its association to Jesus, that all of that, everything he said, he wasn't one knowing he was facing death, as if he was afraid or that he was timid. But instead, he was confident. There was wisdom attached to what he was saying. Yeah, I think that's a great point. Anything else through verse 1? All right, verse 2. So this is where he brings it into the value of the wise, and really more so, he's not really speaking to the kings. He's speaking to those who are wise, who have the king's ear. Verse 2, I say, keep the king's commandment for the sake of your oath to God. Do not be hasty to go from his presence. Do not take your stand for an evil thing, for he does whatever pleases him. So verse 2, keep the king's commandment for what sake? Your oath to God, Solomon says. What does that mean? What oath have we made to God? So what? It's kind of similar to Romans chapter 13, isn't it? Remember we talked before about obeying the king, or obeying the commandments, or obeying the laws, not only because of being afraid of punishment, but also for why else? Because God is watching, God knows. And what oath have we made that is in any way related to the sense of obeying the king's command? What have we told God we're going to do?
Which is the whole duty of man is fear God and keep his commandments.
Okay, and what has God commanded that we do? Obey the king. So when he says obey the king's commandment, not for the sake of obeying the king's commandment, not for the sake of keeping yourself safe or for the sake of preventing some kind of disaster or preventing yourself from being executed, because of your oath to God. Well, you've committed yourself to obeying God, to serving Him, to pleasing Him. And God says routinely throughout the Old Testament and even into the New Testament, render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's. And He even in other places describes, to whom honor, give honor. To whom fear, give fear. Peter describes that. Is it Peter? In 1 Peter chapter 3, chapter 2. Honor to whom honor, fear to whom fear. All of this, Paul also says it as well. I think it's in Romans. He describes all of this from the perspective that you are to obey those governing authorities because God has placed, not necessarily that specific president or king or anyone else, but He has placed that system of government to be there to help you, not to be against you. Now, that's not to say that man hasn't abused those positions of power, but generally speaking, the characteristics of Christians, the characteristics of people who please God, these are not characteristics that kings and governments want to eradicate. People who are kind, people who are generous, people who seek the well-being of others, who seek to help others, people who believe in obeying the law. It would be kind of contrary to the very purpose of kings and governments to eliminate people like that. Again, not that it hasn't happened in history, but the fact that this is what Christians are called to be, this is what people of God are called to be, this is something that should lend you more into the king's favor than not. So when Solomon says, keep the king's commandment for the sake of your oath to God, you obey the commandments of the king. Sometimes we may not like the commandments of the king. Okay, I can know... toss a coin and you'll hit somebody who really doesn't like the fact of certain taxes or certain policies or whatever. And that's going to be the case. It's always been the case, and it will always be the case. And it doesn't matter what form of government you're in. There will always be somebody with a thought process, things could really be done better, or a different policy for this, or a different way of doing that, or a different tax code. But in the end, what should we do? We should obey the king's command. And then he says in verse 3, do not be hasty to go from his presence. If you have an opportunity to be in the presence of the king, which is to say, you have an opportunity to influence those in positions of authority and power, don't quickly walk away from that. Do not be hasty to go from his presence. This isn't just a sense of forsaking the king and trying to overthrow him. That's not what Solomon is describing. This term presence, being in the place of, being with, or in some way, and especially in our country, we have a republic, democratic republic. We have the opportunity to talk to our representatives, to inform them what we think about things and why we think it. Okay, we at least have those opportunities. But especially those who are in perhaps state government, those who are in federal government, those who have an opportunity to influence for good. Solomon says, not be hasty to go from his presence. And keep in mind, the context of this is regarding wise men. Okay, the king's going to want wise people around him. It is to that state that Solomon's speaking all of this in the first place. Keep the king's commands. Even if you, being wise, know that the king's commandment is foolish, keep the commandment for the sake of your oath to God. Now we know, of course, going forward even into the New Testament, we know that the only situation in which we should disobey a commandment of the king is when by obeying that command, we would end up transgressing the commandment of God. Okay? So notice the next part of this, verse 3. Do not take your stand for an evil thing, for he does whatever pleases him. There are those who, some of these commentaries describe verse 3 as, don't be willing to stand with the king if the king wants to do something evil. That's not what Solomon's saying. It's actually the other way around. And I'm going to tell you why he's saying this. Do not take your stand. In other words, don't stand against the king if the king decides to do something evil, for he's going to do whatever pleases him. That's not to say that as wise people that they shouldn't say, hey, king, this is not a good thing to do. Solomon's not describing an act that would include people of God in an evil act and thereby transgressing a commandment of God. That's not what Solomon's describing. He's describing not just a foolish decision, but a really, really bad decision. Something that really is not going to go well, something that might be evil for the king to do. And as a wise person, notice he's going to say here in verse 5, a wise man's heart discerns both time and judgment, because for every matter there is a time and judgment. And we're going to get to that context, but it's still that context of when do you decide to correct the king and when do you don't? And it's almost as if Solomon says you've got to pick and choose your battles. Because the king, the word of the king, there is power. Who may say to him, what are you doing? Verse 4 is connected to verse 3 in that the king's going to do what he wants. Now, it's not to say, hey, if he asks your opinion, he says, hey, this is what I want to do. What do you think? King, I don't think that's a good idea. That's going to put you in a position of making a really, really bad choice, or perhaps even a sinful choice, an evil choice, a choice that may come back on the country or the kingdom that could cause issues and problems for us. But what Solomon says is, don't take your stand. If the king wants to do this, there's nothing you can do about it. He does whatever pleases him, and he has the power. So who can say to him, what are you doing? Nobody can say that to him. And that's what Solomon, he's not saying, and let me be clear here, he's not saying that we shouldn't protest against evil or sinful or whatever, or protest against things we really believe in a political nature, okay? Certainly I think we need to be careful as Christians getting involved in specific aspects of protesting against what we might consider moral behavior in the broader scheme of recognizing that if we do that, we have to protest against all immoral behavior. Got to be careful with that. You can't just pick one thing like gay marriage and say, well, I'm going to pick it and protest against this, but when it comes to other stuff like adultery or fornication, that's not a big deal. But gay marriage, that's a bad thing, or abortion, that's a bad thing, to the exclusion of all else. Okay? We can do what we can to utilize our influence to try to help people understand good and bad, right and wrong. But in the end, we have to be very careful how we go about using our freedoms as Christians in this country to make sure we don't set the wrong example of what could be taken as being hypocrisy. But what he says in verse 3 is, being a wise person, being in that position of influence, use your influence if you can. But don't take your stand against him, because it's not going to do anything. Again, he's not describing something that the king wants to do that's going to cause you to sin. That's not what Solomon's describing. Solomon's describing you're in a position, the king wants to do something bad. He wants to do something evil. Let's say he wants to go destroy an entire village of villagers. King, that's a really bad idea. That's not going to be helpful for our country or our kingdom. You really shouldn't do that. Don't take your stand against it. He's going to do what he wants to do. That's why he says there in verse 5, he who keeps his command will experience nothing harmful, and a wise man's heart discerns both time and judgment. You have to pick and choose your battles. You have to be careful what you say and when you say it when you're dealing with the king's authority. All right, we'll stop there. We'll pick up verse 4 and 5. I hope I made myself clear when we were discussing. We'll talk more about it, but if you have any concerns or questions about that, let me know, and I'll talk to you after worship. Thank you, everybody, for thoughts and comments.